Another source of regret, and I will get on to the sources of joy, don't worry, but another source of regret is that the British people have been so persistently misrepresented in recent years. I think it's fair to say that if you were to read the German press, or the American press actually, you would get an entirely fallacious view of the British public, the British people, and why we voted the way that we did. We've even seen the phenomenon of an incredibly base form of analysis which has been promulgated, I think most notably by the New York Times, which says that Boris Johnson is exactly the same as Donald Trump, and its analysis runs very little deeper than both of them have wacky hair. I cannot stress enough how pitiful this is, that at a time when we need to understand each other deeply, when we need to reconcile ourselves to very significant problems that still lie ahead, that major newspapers would still pump out analysis of such incredible shallowness. In the New York Times, we've recently learned that in Britain, until only a few years ago, we ate nothing much but mutton. Readers of the New York Times could learn that one of the major areas in the centre of London was a place called Mayfield, and we could learn day in, day out quite how racist and appalling the British people are, most recently by the New York Times giving its main opinion page, which I read in the international edition on the way over yesterday, to a famous Leninist. So that is, as I say, one other source of sadness, the conspiracy theories which we've had pumped around, conspiracy theories which are not entirely alien to some people in this hall. The claim, for instance, that we did not vote the way we did because we were unhappy with the settlement in the European Union since at least Maastricht, but we voted the way we did either because we're racist or xenophobic or homophobic or misogynist, they can do anything, but also because, for instance, we had been manipulated by Russia, or that the Poles had been manipulated, or that something else had happened, that there were dark arts, and that the British people hadn't just been unhappy with the European Union for decades, but we'd been perfectly happy until a few Russian bots suddenly got into our mother's Twitter accounts and, hey, we voted to leave. And this is a source of sadness because anyone who wants the European Union to succeed, and indeed anyone who wants the people of Europe to succeed, you would have thought would try to contend with arguments at their most serious. And the argument that the British people had at its most serious is worth contending with. And I'll get on to it in a moment. But let me just, before that, say one other quick thing on that, which is that our vote has, and again this is a source of sadness, exposed a quite amazing, spiteful duplicity in people who one had expected better of. At the weekend, Donald Tusk urged the breakup of my country, the United Kingdom. The European Parliament managed, the night after we left the European Union, to run a massive light campaign on one of the buildings in Strasbourg, urging Scotland to come into the European Union, which is, of course, to ask Scotland to vote again. And by the way, there was a plebiscite 4 years ago, and the Scottish people voted to remain in the United Kingdom. It is not for Brussels to tell the British people who should be allowed to be British. It is... And it seems to me quite remarkable that somebody like Tusk, and indeed other people who have recently been in prominent positions or who are still, could think that that is their task. If we are going to get on in the years ahead, and we will have to and we should, that is exactly the sort of thing that will have to stop. Now, I said I would get on to some of the joys. The first is this, and this is scoffed at by all sorts of people and publications, but it is simply the significance of the return of our sovereignty as a nation. Many people have pretended that the British people do not understand the concept of sovereignty, that it is something so abstract that only a professor or somebody with a PhD could possibly understand this concept, and that it is beyond the people. And I can only tell you, and the poll evidence supports this, the British people understood very distinctly the significance of sovereignty. Now, Tony Benn, the late Labour politician, who I don't often quote with praise, nevertheless, who was an early Eurosceptic, had a very useful shorthand for this. Tony Benn used to say there were 5 questions that he always asked people in power. The first was, what power have you got? The second was, where did you get it from? The third, in whose interests do you exercise it? The fourth, to whom are you accountable? And the fifth, how can we get rid of you? Now, as it happened, I should mention, when Tony Benn met Saddam Hussein, he'd asked none of those questions, but this is a detail of history that but these are very useful questions, and the last of those in particular, how can we get rid of you, was simply a question that the British people no longer believed that they were given an honest answer to. They didn't know who governed them. They were uncomfortable. We were uncomfortable with the manner in which we were governed. We were uncomfortable with the ideas of where the laws were made, and we were uncomfortable with the idea that we could hold to account those people who made those laws if they were bad. In the same issue of the New York Times I read on the plane yesterday, I read a sob story about an MEP called Claude Moraes. Now, the New York Times covered the fact that he has been in the European Parliament for just over 2 decades. He's been on many committees. He's also been a vice president of the Parliament's centre-left grouping. And the piece covered the tragedy of the fact that Claude Moraes was having to pack up his office in Brussels. His papers were going into boxes, doubtless to be filed in a university and be pored over by generations of students in the years to come. And he also had a beautiful view from his office, which he would no longer be able to enjoy. And this was all presented in the manner of a sob story. And I, at any rate, made a little punch of the air on the plane. And this was because I do not believe that if you seized 1 million people and asked them in Britain if they'd ever heard of Claude Moraes, one of their MEPs, I don't think 1 in a million could say they had heard of him. And if you did find of them, it would be one of the little Moraes children or something. And you see, I think this is absolutely emblematic of the problem. We didn't know how to get rid of these people. We didn't know who they were. And so, in some very beautiful way, the levers of our democracy have come back to us. It doesn't mean, of course, that it'll all be brilliant. It could well go wrong. Everything always can. But at least we know where the levers of our democracy now are. Another point of joy, I would say, is the reassertion of our national consensus over Brexit in the way that it is a healthy value. Now, I stress this again. Britain and the detractors of Brexit always, I think, fail to deal with this. Britain is a remarkable country in many ways, but in one way in particular it's worth highlighting. We have never had a far-right political party, not just anywhere near power, but even in Parliament. It has not happened. All across Europe, we have the fears, there are actual far-right parties, and there are parties that are accused of being far-right. But in Britain, not one person who is far-right has ever even made it to Parliament. Why? I would say, among other things, it's because we take seriously, in things like the Brexit vote, the idea that the people should have a say in how they are governed, and do not allow resentments to fester and build until they blow out of the side in a volcanic eruption. And I think that that fact is another one that we have a right to be proud of in Britain. We're proud of the fact that we recently saw off a far-left contender for the British Prime Ministership and British government, a contender who reminded us that anti-Semitism and racism are by no means the preserve of the far right, but can be indulged in and indeed welcomed by the far left just as easily. And I would say that it's important to remember that Brexit is a reasonable expression of nationalism in the way I would reframe it in the British sense, which is simply in the means of patriotism. Roger Scruton, who was mentioned earlier and who's on much of our minds, wrote in what was one of his last books, as it turned out, "For ordinary people living in free association with their neighbours, the nation means simply the historical identity and continuing allegiance that unites them in the body politic. It is the first-person plural of settlement. sentiments of national identity may be inflamed by war, civil agitation, and ideology, and this inflammation admits of many degrees, but in their normal form these sentiments are not just peaceful in themselves, but a form of peace in others. And Scruton points out that the virtues and also the flaws of the religious model of we, for when it comes to the matter of law, for instance, he says secular law adapts, religious law endures. When God makes the laws become as mysterious as God is. When we make the laws and make them for our purposes, we can be certain what they mean. The only question then is, who are we? And in modern conditions, he finishes, the nation is the answer to that question, an answer without which we are all at sea. Now, we in Britain have, broadly speaking, thought of ourselves, and think of ourselves still, as largely a force for good in the world. We are buffeted, as everyone is, by the stories of self-hatred. We are buffeted, as everyone else is by the worst aspects of our history. But by and large, the British people, and the Brexit vote is a fine demonstration of this, think that we have been more a force for good in the world than a force for ill, and have not wanted to listen to those people who've tried to contend maliciously otherwise. But none of it is new. As I draw to a close, I should stress that none of this is new, and the defamation of the British public is not new. In his reflections on the revolution in France, Edmund Burke mentions the radical pamphleteer and advocate of the rights of man, Dr. Richard Price, and he mentions Dr. Price's passing reference to the dregs of the people who are generally paid for their votes, the dregs of the people. And Burke says, you will smile here at the consistency of those Democrats who, when they are not on their guard, treat the humbler part of the community with the utmost contempt.
We will make America great again.